Okay, let's jump right into a moment that honestly reshaped the early 21st century. We're going to unpack how the case for war in Iraq was built around one central explosive claim, that Saddam Hussein possessed weapons of mass destruction. And listen to these words. This wasn't some vague hint or a suggestion, right? This was presented to the entire world as a cold, hard fact, an imminent threat. And it was delivered on the global stage by Colin Powell, who at the time was one of the most respected and trusted figures in America. That's a huge deal. So how did we get to that point? To really get it, we've got to rewind the clock a bit, back to late 2002 and early 2003. This whole narrative, it didn't just pop up overnight. Nope. It was carefully and deliberately constructed piece by piece. And this timeline, wow, it shows you just how fast everything changed. After the 9/11 attacks, the world's focus shifted dramatically. The war on terror became this new lens for looking at global threats, and almost instantly, that lens was pointed squarely at Saddam Hussein's Iraq. These were the talking points you heard over and over and over again. 1. Iraq is hiding WMDs. 2. They might be building a nuke. And 3. This was the really terrifying part. They could give those weapons to terrorists. It painted this incredibly frightening picture. And if UN inspectors on the ground said, hey, we're not seeing this, the response was always, well, that's just because Saddam is an expert at deception. So the invasion happens. Militarily, it was incredibly swift, over in a matter of weeks. But the justification for it all, the entire house of cards the war was built on, yeah, that was about to come crashing down. Okay, so once the major combat was over, the real search began. And let me be clear, this wasn't a casual look around. This was the Iraq Survey Group, a massive operation with hundreds of international experts scouring the entire country. And what they found, or more accurately, what they didn't find, would change the story completely. Just look at this. The contrast is just stark. The claim was an active nuclear program. The finding? It didn't exist. The claim was large, hidden stockpiles of chemical weapons. The finding? They'd been mostly destroyed back in the 90s. Those infamous mobile biolabs? No operational weapons or stockpiles were ever found. The threat that was presented with such absolute certainty, it just wasn't there. So this brings us to the biggest question of all, doesn't it? If the weapons weren't there, how on earth did so many people, from politicians to the public watching the news, become so utterly convinced that they were? You know, the simple answer would be to call it some giant secret conspiracy. But the evidence points to something more complex, and maybe even more troubling. It seems to have been a systemic bureaucratic failure, where a desired outcome ended up shaping the intelligence instead of the other way around. And this is basically the playbook for how it all went down. It's a process. First, you start with the conclusion you want. We need to remove Saddam Hussein. Then you cherry-pick the intelligence. Any piece of info that fits that narrative, even if it's from a sketchy source, gets pushed to the top. Meanwhile, any information that contradicts the narrative gets downplayed, filtered out, or just never makes it up the chain of command. And finally, you get this massive echo chamber where everyone is repeating the same story until it feels like the truth. And here's the kicker. This story wasn't coming from the fringes. It was coming from the most trusted sources imaginable. We're talking about presidents, prime ministers, official intelligence agencies, and major news networks. When all the institutions you're taught to trust are telling you the exact same thing, it becomes incredibly difficult for an ordinary person to question it. But this wasn't just some academic mistake, right? It wasn't a typo in a report. This was an intelligence failure that led to a war. And the real-world consequences, well, they were devastating, and they continue to shape the entire region to this day. Let's just look at the balance sheet. On the negative side, it's catastrophic. Hundreds of thousands of people died. The Iraqi state completely collapsed, leading to a brutal civil war. And that power vacuum directly created the conditions for ISIS to emerge. The fallout destabilized an entire region. On the other side, the positives are really just hard-won lessons. It forced a painful reckoning for intelligence agencies and the media, and it created a deep public skepticism of official announcements that, honestly, is still with us today. So, what's the big takeaway from all of this? Why is it so important to keep talking about it? Because the story of Iraq's non-existent WMDs isn't just history. It's a timeless and frankly essential lesson in critical thinking. This really gets to the heart of it. Before the war, the few people who dared to question the official story were often dismissed. They were labeled conspiracy theorists or anti-American and were basically kicked out of the mainstream conversation. It's a classic example of a position that was factually correct being treated like a fringe, crazy belief.
So this event gives us a kind of toolkit for how to analyze information. It teaches us that it's not enough to just ask, is this true? We have to go deeper. We have to ask, who is telling the story? What's their agenda? What are they choosing to highlight? And maybe most important of all, what are they choosing to leave out? Because that's often where the real story is hiding.
And that remains the central challenge, doesn't it? This whole episode is a powerful reminder that the line between a reasonable doubt and a wild theory can be completely redrawn by people in power. It teaches us that the most important thing we can do isn't just to believe or disbelieve, but to constantly and critically question everything.